Welcome to the second Premodern Korea lecture series. I'm very delighted to host Professor Kang Lee from South Korea. In September at the first Premodern Korea lecture series, Michael Pettit presented on Lady E's The Encyclopedia on Daily Life, Kyuhap Chongseok from Joseon Dynasty. Today, we will go further back in history to hear about Koryô Dynasty and its relationship with the Mongol Yuan Empire. Let me first introduce Dr. Kang Lee. He's a professor in the Korean History Department at the Academy of Korean Studies in Seongnam, Korea. He studies and teaches the history of the Koryô Dynasty and its relationship with the Mongols, Yuan Empire. He's the author of 고려와 원제국의 교역의 역사, Trade Between Koryô and Yuan, published in 2013, and 고려의 자기 원제국과 만나다, Koryô Porcelain in Contact with the Mongol Yuan Empire, published in 2016. Currently, he also serves as the chief editor for the Review of Korean Studies, an English journal published by the Academy of Korean Studies. He received his PhD from Seoul National University. So before I turn it over to Professor Lee, I would like to ask our audience to submit their questions to the Q&A box. Please feel free to submit anytime. I will try to address as many questions as I can during the Q&A session. Well, then, without further ado, I will now ask Professor Lee to give his presentation.
Thank you very much, Professor Kim. I'm very honored to be here, and I thank you very much for the opportunity to address all these wonderful people around the world. It's rare for me to share my thoughts with people outside Korea, so it's very thrilling to be here. Yeah. The title of my lecture today would be Unique Relationship in Korea and the Mongol Yuan Empire. But after establishing a title like this, I was afraid it may be a little bit misleading. The relationship Korea had with the Mongol Yuan Empire was very different from the Korean Peninsula had with other Chinese dynasties before. So in that regard, the relationship Korea had with the Mongol Yuan Empire was a very much unique relationship in the eyes of the Korea people, and that is to be sure. But then again, the history of between Korea and the Mongol Yuan Empire was also a history of a group of people trying to adapt to a rather harsh and unprecedented situation and trying to just live through the era. So in that regard, also it is unique in some sense, the relationship between Korea and the Mongol Empire and the lives the Korea people had to go through in this era. It's pretty much the same as any other group of people may have experienced while they were trying to live through the Mongol experience they had to deal with. So let's begin. The Mongol legacy, of course, may be one of the most prominently discussed themes in global history. The rise of the Mongols was a truly global event, and it's really amazing to see how they managed to establish an empire that would affect millions of lives for centuries to come. 13th and the 14th centuries was indeed a time when the world changed irrevocably. And in terms of being affected by such a global phenomenon, the Korean Peninsula was no exception. The Mongols hit the region in what was the second half for the Koryå dynasty, which was founded in 918 and was later replaced by another dynasty, which is well known as the name Joseon, in 1392. And the impact from the Mongols was gigantic, to say the least. Also, the first encounter with the Mongols in 1218 was not that bad. In the early phase of the Mongol move over to the Northeast Asian regions, they initiated small-scale incursions, and in the process, whenever they faced a problem, they would ask nearby polities for joint campaigns against hostile forces, hostile to them, of course. Koryå was one of those polities. And upon receiving such request from the Mongols in 1218, the Koryõ people naturally got nervous. But they couldn't find a reason to decline because they feared that they would become the next target if they do so. Fortunately, the campaign itself wrapped up amicably, even earning the Koryõ generals who joined the campaign the title of Brothers of the Mongols. However, one thing led to another, and not before long, the Koryõ people found themselves being invaded by the Mongol forces in 1231. The invasion was only delayed, seemingly because the Mongols had to put their house in order first and secure a upper hand on the Jurchen dynasty. For the Koryõ people, the year 1231 marked the beginning of a 30-year war with the Mongols, which continued on and off due to negotiations and internal Mongol conditions. Yet the war itself managed to inflict severe, catastrophic damages on the Korean peninsula. The capital of the dynasty had to be transferred to the Kang Island in 1232. And some of the northern territory, was lost to the Mongols, and the Koryõ people continued to resist, but they were not able to fend off the country well. The reality of this era are conveyed in tales and records, but they're nothing short of devastating. The amount of lives lost was horrific. It is estimated that more than 200,000 lives were lost in the year 1254 alone. And of course, countless cultural heritages were destroyed. The war only stopped in 1259 when a truce was established between Koryõ and the Mongol generals. But the Mongol threat was hardly over. The fact that the newly enthroned Emperor Kublai was busy quashing the competition from his own brother and other Chinese figures challenging the prospect of Mongol dominance only marginally helped Koryõ. It took nearly a decade for Koryõ to decide to return to its old capital in Kaesong, here as Kaegyeong. In 1269, the capital was abandoned, as mentioned earlier, in 1232 to evade the Mongol troops. And soon after began an enormous aftermath, laced with unprecedented level of imperial political interference and social changes. Also, Emperor Kublai, who was enthroned in 1260 and died in 1294, he declared that he had no intention of forcing the Koryõ people to abandon their traditions or change or alter their way of lives. The pressure felt by the Koryõ people was high. Koryõ King Chungyeol, who was enthroned in 1274 and died in 1308, he had to preemptively modify Koryõ institutions by first restructuring the government and changing all the names of the governmental offices. And the society had to go through a major shakeup as well, as their attires and hairstyles were all changed in favor of a new one, the Mongol style. And things did not stop there. As part of the Koryõ king's political initiative, King Wonjong to be exact, a marital relationship was suggested by Koryõ King Wonjong, as mentioned earlier. And after some hesitation on Kublai's part, an agreement was forged and a Mongol princess came to Koryõ as the newly wedded wife of Koryõ King Chungyeol. All the Koryõ kings who followed King Chungyeol were descendants of this marriage, born as hybrids, harboring not only Koryõ but Mongol bloods in their veins. And in the meantime, Kublai's old plan to conquer the Southeast Asian regions was heating up and as part of that agenda, the goal of conquering Japan was hotly pursued as well. The Korean Peninsula was inevitably chosen as a front line for that task, serving as both a munition base and a shipyard. Countless ships were constructed here, while workforce and supplies were drafted by the Koryō government at the request of the empire, of course. Most importantly, in order to facilitate such effort, the Yuan Empire established a provincial branch secretariat known as the Jongun on the Korean Peninsula, and appointed the Koryō king as the provincial governor to supervise that body. After being inducted into the Mongol imperial family as a royal son-in-law, the Koryō king was once again tied into the administrative structure of the empire, this time as a local authoritative figure. Considering all these things that I just mentioned, Korean historians, they felt that it would only be appropriate to evaluate the nature of this time period based on all these facts. And so they came up with a rather handy term to refer to this time period in Korean history as the Yuan intervention period. Considering all the things Koryō had to go through ever since the first invasion on Koryō territory, it seems like an understandable term to describe this period in particular. Yet the term is not without some problems, and it turned out to be actually very misleading, to say the least. First and foremost, it is a term that has no clear beginning or end points. Are we going to count 1218 when Koryō encountered the Mongols for the very first time as the beginning point for this supposed period? Or for that matter, shall we pick 1231 when the year the Mongol invasion actually began? Or 1259 when the truce was arranged and Koryō was forced into an official relationship with the Mongol Yuan Empire, or even 1274, when King Chunyeong, as mentioned right earlier, married a Mongol princess. Each time point brought different kinds of changes to Koryō and also its relationship with the outside world. So to the Koryō people, the 13th century was just a chain of events that forced them to adapt. And there was no clear starting point for the people who actually lived through this period. And same goes for the end point as well. There are many options from which we can choose, like 1356, when King Gongmin, who was enthroned in 1351 and was assassinated in 1374, not by the Mongols, but from one of his vassals. In 1356, he supposedly launched the so-called anti-Yuan reforms. So that is usually counted as an ending point to this supposed period in Korea right now, but I tend to disagree. And there are other time points as well, like 1367 or 8, when the Yuan Empire was dismantled and the Mongols moved to the north, leaving Beijing behind. There are basically dozens of different time periods throughout the late 14th century as the Mongols' influence on Koryō shifted many times. It is hard to choose one point at the cost of all others, as different issues had been progressing on different timetables and were being resolved accordingly at different time points as well. For example, in 1356, the year which I just mentioned, Koryō, under King Gongmin's governance, was able to reclaim some of its old territory that had been usurped by the Mongols earlier. But that was not the end of King Gongmin's dealings with the empire, because Gongmin's conflicts with the Yuan royal family, and especially with Dowager Empress Gi, who was actually a native Koryō female, continued into the early 1360s. And while Koryō's relationship with the Yuan Empire was virtually dissolved, In 1367, when the Mongols abandoned Beijing, the Mongols remained as a major threat to Korea security to the very end of the dynasty in 1392. So it is abundantly clear that as the Korea people's dealings with certain issues wrapped up here and there, the Korea society in general was also entering new individual situations which we would have to examine and evaluate separately on their own. Turning a blind eye to such delicate nature of this period, I fear we run the risk of oversimplifying the complex historical truth of this period. Now, all these time points were important ones in the Koryõ-Mongol relationship. There's an even bigger problem with this term, which is the audacity of attempting to define the nature of a period that clearly lasted nearly 2 centuries with a single word. The term has usually been used to describe both the 13th and 14th centuries as a whole, but the underlying implications of that term do not suit the reality of the latter century, the 14th. The area of economy is the most glaring example. Here we can see the blatant pillaging of Korea resources in the form of requested tributes significantly reduced in the ending years of the 13th century. It was not because of any change of heart on the Mongols' part or due to the Mongols' decision to upgrade treatment of Koryõ kings who were now sons-in-law of the Mongol royal family, but with the absorption of the Chinese Jongun region after the Chinese Song dynasty's fall in 1276 at the hands of the Mongols, increased taxation in the area resulted in an explosive jump in revenue income for the Mongol imperial government in the late 13th century. And I think that made further extraction of resources from smaller and more barren regions like the Korean Peninsula unnecessary and simply meaningless. Such reduced extraction of materials led to enhancements in Korea's economic condition. And as the situation surrounding both the government and the civilian businesses continued to get better, normal domestic transactions resumed and foreign trades started to boom again. Civilians' activities in China increased, as we can see from several linguistic manuals, more like handbooks for foreign language conversations, such as Dogulde and Baktongsa here, while the economic policies and trade initiatives launched by the Koryõ kings are well depicted in official records. For example, King Chungsun, who was first enthroned in 1298, but was dethroned only 8 months later and only was able to return to the Koryõ throne in 1308, like a decade later, when his father, King Chungmyeol, died. King Chungsun and his grandson, Chunghae, who ruled Korea in the early 1330s and early 1340s, they were kings who were very much interested in export products production. The former King Chungsun created a new governmental office to facilitate creation of dyed apparels, while King Chunghae created a palace-sized manufacturing facility to produce, we presume, Nazi-like textiles. If he did, that would have been definitely inspired by the West Asian Tiras facilities through the information that he received from his Ilkhanate contacts. Meanwhile, King Chungsuk, who was the son of King Chungsun and ruled Korea in the 1310s, 20s, and 30s, he was perhaps the unluckiest one among all the kings who ruled Korea in this period, because he was once detained in Beijing for like 5 years, from 1321 to 1325. But he managed to utilize that time period, that situation, to the best of his abilities, because he befriended many foreign merchants, took them home with him on his way home, and awarded them with governmental posts and titles, effectively recruiting Chinese, Uyghur, and Muslim traders into a human network that may have aided the Korea government in its outward investments. So we can see the area of economy alone renders the term Yuan intervention period less than accurate, but the inappropriate nature of this term becomes even more obvious if we observe other areas as well. For example, the area of politics may be worth examining. Of course, the political situation was still in flux, and pressure from the Mongols was still there. We can see that from certain examples of some political factions attempting to replace the aforementioned Jongun government with an even more powerful branch secretariat, so that it could control Korea more strongly and directly. And there was also an attempt that lasted for 2 decades, meaning to replace King Chungsuk with another family member of the Koryå royal family with more immediate ties to Yuan imperial dignitaries. But in the end, all these attempts launched by not only Mongol, but some Koryå figures as well, all successfully thwarted by the Koryå government. Although a considerable amount of political capital was spent, the Koryå royal family, its legacy, and their status as the singular political authority on the peninsula managed to prevail. More importantly, in the wake of all these failed political machinations, the Jongun provincial government, which once severely limited the original Koryå government's autonomous functions back in the 1270s and 80s, grew weaker and weaker in the wake of all this. And at the same time, the Koryå king's authority continued to grow, beginning already in the 1270s, late 1270s, of course. King Chunmyo was able to use his new status and identity as a son-in-law of the Mongol imperial family in increasing his own negotiating power, and managed to persuade Yuan to withdraw his troops from the peninsula in 1278. The following kings were even better equipped to handle the Mongol interference in retrospect. The kings, beginning with King Chungsan when he was still the crown prince of Koryå, all of them were demanded to stay inside China for an extended period of time. And be present in the imperial palace to observe all the deliberations and activities going on inside the Yuan capital. And ironically, of course, such a demand on the Yuan Empire's part would have been to ensure that the Koryå kings would be cultivated into characters that would inherently accept and embrace the superior nature of the empire. But ironically, such extended stays in Yuan armed Koryå kings with knowledge in imperial operations and also some leverage in maneuvering political affairs that involved the Mongols in the future. For example, his son King Chunmyo's son, King Chungsan, he was also, as mentioned earlier, because he was the direct product of his Koryå father, King Chunmyo, and his Mongol mother, the daughter of Emperor Kublai, no less. He was actually the maternal grandson of the late Mongol Emperor Kublai, and he was able to wield considerable amount of political power in both Koryå and Yuan. He was instrumental in enthroning both emperors Kaishan and Ayurbarwada, both in 1308 and 1311. And he also aided in the imperial government's launch of the civil examination system in 1314. And he was also very much helpful in Emperor Ayurbarwada launching his own certain Buddhist projects. He also befriended many scholars and artists in the Chinese China region and spread Koryå culture in the region as well. Meanwhile, as the king of Koryå, he sponsored the embracement of many Yuan institutions while ensuring the Koryå government, ensuring the Koryå customs to remain intact. It should be yeah, as mentioned earlier, he was born in 1275, King Chungsan, and we believe he went over to China before he hit 10. And when he returned to Koryå, and until he returned to Koryå in 1298, we believe that he stayed like more than a decade in China. So naturally, Chungsan, he was able to witness so many things inside China. He was able to like get acquainted with important people. He even, when I earlier mentioned that he was dethroned. He was enthroned for the first time in Koryå in the year 1298, but was only able to stay on the throne for like 8 months because he was dethroned by the Mongol Empire. He returned to China and then came back a decade later, only when his father died, and he had to assume the throne again. During that period, that 10 years in China, he's actually spent the same residence with brothers Taishan and Ayurbarwada, who later became emperors with help of King Chungsan. So and during that time, he would have conversed with all kinds of important dignitaries inside one, and would have learned so much of how things, what kind of things were going on, how things were being resolved, how what kind of issues were being discussed by the government. So in the process, he was able to learn so many things, and later, when he became the Koryå king, he was able to utilize certain institutional elements of the imperial government to fix some age-old problems of the already centuries-old traditional institutions of Koryå, while also actually reviving several elements from past Koryå administrative traditions, if necessary, taking advantage of the Yuan government's investment in utilizing the old Chinese ways. And also later, King Gongmin, who was the grandson of King Chungsan, King Gongmin cited Yuan's past promises in order to make sure the empire endorse some Koryå policies and grant King Gongmin's certain requests. Echoing the efforts of his predecessor, King Chungmok, here in the third paragraph, King Chungmok, who took advantage of an imperial order to stabilize the country as an excuse to launch an offense against certain pro-Yuan Koryå factions, King Gongmin cited the late Emperor Kublai's words that one would not force Koryå to change its way of life, and pointed out that certain things that had been going on between Koryå and the Mongols in the mid-14th century were not part of Kublai's grand plan for Koryå, and therefore hardly justified to be allowed to continue. It was Gongmin's intention to have the empire not block his domestic reforms, while also have the empire turn a blind eye to the fact that he had to launch such reforms by first eliminating certain powerful and corrupted Koryå officials who had direct ties to the Mongol Empress, Dowager Empress Ki, who, as I said earlier, was originally a Koryå female. In short, I can say that the 14th century was an entirely different time period from the 13th. There was a time during which the Koryå people was able to find some breathing room from the crisis of the past century, and devise a new balance between their old way of life and the new one that was imposed upon them. They even became capable of utilizing the authority of the Mongol emperors and imperial institutions in advancing Koryå-specific agendas or deflecting new Mongol initiatives. So in that regard, this was hardly an era that deserved the aforementioned term, the Yuan intervention period. The term not only paints a wrong picture for the 14th century, but also for the entire second half of the Koryå dynasty, actually. insinuating the dynasty was on a slow but steady decline ever since the Mongol invasion began 200 years ago, a century ago. So I believe that the term does not pay attention to the very lives of the people who lived through this period, and in that regard, it may be, I think that it is a very anti-historical point of view. That can be said because there is another important aspect of this time period, and that is the fact that exchanges of ideas, practices, and inspirations continued on intellectual and artistic levels throughout the entire Korea society. For example, in this period, Neoconfusionism was first introduced to the Korean Peninsula at the end of the 13th century and the beginning of the 14th. It was through the interactions between Koryō and Chinese-based imperial scholars, and it encouraged many Koryō scholars to apply for the Yuan imperial exam, which landed them in quite a few local posts throughout the empire. But at the same time, achievements of renowned literary figures from Koryō, as well as the peninsula's earlier periods like Shilla, they were compiled by people like Trehe, which I'll later elaborate on. And those compilations and collections of Korean masterpieces were introduced to the Mongol writers and what Koryō had to offer. Meanwhile, during the same period, Yuan Buddhism introduced a new Buddhist school to Koryō Buddhism, and it brought quite a change to the Buddhist practices inside Koryō. But based on its own long history and tradition, Koryō Buddhist believers also built many monasteries at Beijing, heart of the empire no less, and significantly facilitated Buddhist exchanges between Koryō and the Mongol schools. And in the area of art and commerce, Yuan porcelain and textile heavily inspired Koryō manufacturers and led to alterations in Koryō domestic celadon production, as well as weaving styles and design patterns. But at the same time, all the Koryō products that were exported to China and West Asia, for that matter, in this period were either Koryō-style ceramics or enhanced Koryō fabrics. While the former, the traditional Koryō-style ceramics, they featured traditional shapes and designs, and Koryō fabrics that were exported to China. They included Reimi-based Nasij-style textiles. So apparently, Koryō producers took advantage of both foreign influence and Koryō's own proud tradition of creating fine products, while merchants found it profitable to export Koryō-style products instead of imitation of Yuan counterparts. So, as we can see, the Koryō people's lives in the 14th century and their relationship with the empire at the time was very much different from the preceding century. Surely Koryō was still under heavy influence of the Mongol Yuan Empire, but Koryō's sovereignty, although it was fiercely challenged by the Mongols at the beginning of the war and in the aftermath, it was never dismantled entirely. And the inside of Koryō was always institutionally separated from China, operating independently and autonomously. For logistic reasons, the empire never levied taxes on the Korean peninsula, and Yuan law was never fully accepted by the Koryō society, as lamented by a departing Yuan official in his confession to his Koryō colleagues, including a renowned official and diplomat, Igor, which I would also like to elaborate later on. Such minute details should not be overlooked, and neither the fact that while Koryō was part of the imperial sphere of influence, it was never a true part of the empire institutionally. But such fact is oftentimes it's wrongfully suggested in world maps as they depict the Korean Peninsula and of this time period and the Mongol Yuan Empire with the same color. The most adequate word to describe the Koryõ people's lives in this period may be multifaceted. The Koryõ people were never either exclusively pro-Yuan or anti-Yuan. Yuan was just a reality to the Koryõ people and was not a hypothetical situation or a piece of imagination. Human beings tend to deal with reality with both moral inclinations and practical considerations. Those two factors lead people to form various positions and perspectives that would suit various situations they are put in. So one can be pro-Yuan and anti-Yuan at the same time, being pro-Yuan in certain issues while being different to deal with others. One can resent the political interference from the Yuan Empire while appreciating advanced cultural inspirations or new economic opportunities. One can fiercely deflect property infringements from the empire while rejoicing at the prospect of new social norms, which could be imported from the outside and bring some changes to the status quo inside Korea in terms of social classes and stratification. And of course, the scholars at the time shared appreciation of Chinese masterpieces while also having pride in Korean literary writings. Historians often forget this and try to view people of the past from a certain frame of perspective and even evaluate them with a predetermined human model imagined from a mindset that did not actually experience the past firsthand. So that would not be nice, I think. There are many materials that we can use and consult to study this particular time period. For the official historical documentation of the Goryeo dynasty, there are the Koryosa and Koryosa Jeoryo. And there is also a geographical encyclopedia entitled 신증 동국 여지승남, and a compilation of classical writings entitled 동문선. And for individual sources of information, we can consult personal anthologies that contain personal writings and correspondences, such as 동국 이상국집 from Lee Gyubo, who lived in the latter half of the 12th century and the early half of the 13th. 동안 거사집 from a person named Lee Seung-hyu, who lived during the 13th century. 익제집 from Lee Jae-hyun, 졸고 천백 from Choi, and 가정집 from Igok. There are so many others that we can choose to examine in the future. And for other types of personal records, grave epitaphs, biographies of individuals buried in tombs, authored by another person, another individual, at the request of the family of the dead person. These grave epitaphs can also be incredibly helpful based on all these materials. Many studies of this era have been passionately conducted by Korean historians and also historians around the world. I would like to introduce some of them. Past studies. First there were studies that emphasized the oppressive nature of the Mongol rule over the Korean peninsula. So many things have been revealed by those studies, so the current generation of scholars in Korea, including myself, are in profound debt to their achievements and accomplishments. But such studies also argued that Koryõ was only able to break free from one's rule, the Mongols' rule, during the reign of King Gongmin, who only became the Koryõ king in the mid-14th century. because King Gongmin was able to reclaim some of the Goryeo territory which had been stolen by Yuan, and at the same time conduct certain anti-Yuan reforms. In my opinion, King Gongmin's contribution to the country was quite obvious, and he did manage to turn the tides in terms of the Goryeo-Yuan relationship. So I'm not denying what King Gongmin did and the value that he had in this time period, but what I have the problem I have with this kind of narrative is that this sort of narrative ends up portraying all the history that came before King Gongmin as a history of merely being oppressed, the Goryeo people merely being oppressed for like 100 years. As a result, all the efforts of the Goryeo people in the previous decades were labeled as ultimately failed ones, just because they were not enough. They were not enough to end the Mongol rule. All the reformative agendas suggested by the earlier kings like King Chungnyeong, Chungsun, Chungsuk, Chunghae, Chungmok, a lot of Chungs, I suppose, I admit. As well as the people, as well as the general public's efforts to make the best of the situation they had been dealt with. They were all condemned as mere struggles and failed attempts to survive in a decimated society colonized by the Mongols. In my eyes, this is pretty unimaginative and, most importantly, inaccurate recreation of this period's history. Historians categorize people of this period into dichotomous inventories, such as anti-Yuan and pro-Yuan. This person was anti-Yuan for his entire life, and this person was pro-Yuan, like in every issues. That sort of behavior was embedded in this particular narrative of previous studies in Korea. So naturally, historians would criticize pro-Yuan figures and praise anti-Yuan figures. Then, coming into the 2000s, new studies start to surface and trying to understand the relationship with the Mongol factor more heavily in mind, feeling that previous studies rather lacked proper understanding of the Mongols or their traditions and only regarded them as aggressors. And new studies try to look into the inner principles of the Mongols and explain why the Koryå-Mongol relationship was formed the way it was. And in the meantime, another branch of studies tried to explore the ambiguous nature of this time period, believing that in such situation, things would not have been that much clear-cut, and Yuan could have meant a lot of things to the Goryeo people and their lives. The premise was that while people could have resented the Mongol interference in certain areas of their lives, they also could have needed, at least, some of them to pursue new social changes, and sometimes even utilize the presence of Mongols to their political advantage. Then, how are studies proceeding right now in the early 2020s? Overall, to my taste, studies are still too much focused on diplomatic interactions between Korea and the empire. New studies that emerged in 2 decades ago did contribute to enlarging the scope of historical studies of this period and enable new attempts. And yet studies are still much pretty engaged in context and exchanges themselves. What kind of effects those interactions, contexts, and exchanges actually had on the inside of Koryо is a question that is yet to be satisfactorily answered. And in my opinion, that is what should be put at the center of future efforts. So, for example, how Goryeo politics changed due to the Mongol factor, not only in terms of political parties and their actions, but also in terms of how politics were manifest institutionally and administratively, should be explored more. One of the prevailing trends I found from this period that I believe is worth pursuing more was the effort, particularly those by the Goryeo leaders, to combine both Koryeo and Yuan elements, or Chinese ones for that matter, in mostly and using them in revising and sometimes even enhancing original Koryō institutions. Quite a few areas can be cited as such examples, like the governmental structure, political reform agendas, fiscal policy initiatives, local administrative system, military drafting principle, and even the internal layout of the new Koryō domestic shrine. This kind of phenomenon of mixture of two worlds was nothing short of a convergence unfolding everywhere across the spectrum, I think. And the kings and officials were not immune to the situation. As already mentioned, the kings were no longer just Koryō kings. They were part of the highest ruling strata of the one ruling structure. And the Koryō officials were also experiencing a similar kind of an identity crisis, as they were now receiving ranks and positions not only from the Koryō king, but also from the Mongol emperor. Under such situation, they were destined to develop perspectives and aspirations different from those of their predecessors. Another aspect of this period that requires more attention is social norms that were changed and norms that remained the same. Some Koryō social customs were like the one that determined the social status of an individual, either as a commoner or a lowborn, when the individual's parents were from different social classes. This particular social norm of Koryō was never affected by one dominance. Imperial law had many regulations for a variety of relevant situations, but they never penetrated the Koryō society, as political intervention was apparently no match for a social infrastructure, which was groomed for centuries. Also later, the Koryō government chose to embrace one legal code to a certain degree. There was still limits to its applications. On the other hand, intellectual thinkers and prolific artistic creators continued to interact with each other frequently. Yeah. So this kind of very complex and multifaceted nature of this this era is, in my opinion, best embodied by a particular character whose name has popped up in this lecture fairly frequently, and that is King Chungsun. For the past decade, I was very much fascinated by this particular figure. Not just because he was the first ever hybrid or a Koryō figure who was carrying a dual heritage. The fact that due to this kind of unique nature, he was doing so many things. I'll just save that for later in Q&A. And he was the embodiment of all the things that were going on in this period. He was well versed in Koryō things. He was well versed in the Mongol things, the Chinese things, and he was able to. And at the same time, he was also the one who was faced with the task of enhancing and overhauling the Koryō institutions, which were ailing at the time, because Koryō was entering its fifth and final century, of course, in retrospect. And the fact that he was able to use all the resources at hand in like repairing Koryō, that was very much fascinating for me, and I was engaged in studying his particular governance for the past decade. But later on, as mentioned here and on screen, others should also be explored, of course. And also, in the future, examination of not only the 13th and 14th centuries, but of course the 15th century as well should be explored more, because the 15th century was not Koryō and Joseon, of course, but it was virtually an extension of the 14th century. So examination of this period would shed light on things that we cannot yet understand due to lack of sufficient historical records. Before wrapping up this lecture, I would like to stress on the importance of all these studies once again. For Koreans, their relationship with the Chinese proper, Northeast Asia for that matter, and beyond all shifted in this period. This makes historical observation of this era's Korean peninsula a useful sample study of a region which reacted to the Mongol factor in its own way. Historical studies of the Mongols, I believe, should not deal with only its conquest or famous emperors, or the well-known fact that already well-known fact that human interactions around the world increased exponentially in this period. But it should also deal with the fact that people in various regions adapted to, evolved, and ultimately took advantage of the Mongol presence. And so, quite naturally, the legacy of Mongols left behind in individual regions not only belong to the Mongols, but also the regions as well. So, in that sense, more studies of Koryō in this period could enrich our understanding of global history too. Yeah. So that would be my lecture. Thank you very much for listening to this may have been sometimes boring lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Lee. That was very insightful lecture. Learned so much, and also about going over the historiography of this, Koryō period. That was very helpful. And we already received many questions, so I would like to get into those questions right away. But I think really your contribution is trying to illuminate this, interaction between Mongols and Yuan Empire and the Koryō period. It wasn't just, simply oppressive period that we can just, describe this period as just being oppressive for 200 years, but it's more really about interaction. And I think it's, I think the point you're trying to address is there's also Korean agency in this relationship. And the kind of interaction that you introduced, I think that was just fascinating to learn. All right, so the first question is by Anna McIntyre. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your last name. Are there any lasting cultural, political, or economical influences from Mongol and Koryō exchange and interaction that can be identified in Korea today?
Yeah. Like, of course, naturally, all the political legacy and economic effects that had come from the Mongol presence on Koryō in the 13th and 14th centuries, they transferred to the 15th century, and actually in the 15th century, like the early half of it, during the reigns of Kings Taejong or Sejong, there are many discussions inside the government whether or not to preserve and continue this particular tradition that had been inherited from the earlier periods, or shall we discontinue and deny such discontinue such practices. So the Mongol legacy in terms of politics and economy, that pretty much dissolves throughout the 15th century, I believe. But cultural aspects did manage to survive, and actually some things that we can witness today in the current culture are known to have been from this particular period. Of course, people today do not engage in traditional marriage ceremonies, but there are some headgears that the females in Korea used in those marriage ceremonies, jokduri or some other things. They are known to have been from the Mongols. And of course, the most famous Korean beverage, liquor, soju, although it is being manufactured in a different way from the fashion it was produced in this particular time period. But the term soju, yeah, that is also known to have been from this period. But like legacy in terms of political institutions or economic things, those are things that I'm afraid we cannot see in Korea today, actually. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So next question by Eugene Chang. Would there be any geological reasons for Mongolians' choice on Kanghwa Island as their first invasion?
Kangha was not the first place to be invaded. Of course, the peninsula itself was first invaded, and the Goryeo government chose to abandon the original capital and move over to the Ganghwa-do Island, which was at the southwest side of the peninsula. We imagine that because it was an island and was separated from the peninsula by sea, it would have made it very hard for the Mongol troops to invade the island as well. But and that was true in the beginning of the war in the 1230s actually. But there are some records that the Mongol troops were beginning to use not only cavalry but ships and naval forces to attack certain areas of the Chinese east coast. So that would have made the Goryeo government very much nervous. We cannot be sure that was behind some of the reasons the Goryeo government would eventually decide to return to the old capital, but the position of Ganghwa Island, it made the Goryeo government safe in the beginning of the war, but as time progressed, the Ganghwa Island itself may have grew to become vulnerable as well, but we cannot be sure to which degree. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Next question by Nathan Walton. Do you think there was different levels of Yuan influence in northern and southern Koryeo? And how was the northern territory of Koryeo taken by the Yuan during the first invasion reintegrated into Koryeo?
Yeah, as we can imagine, the northern parts of the Korean peninsula was the first region to be hit by the invading Mongol forces. So Korean historians have been able to categorize all the different invasions that occurred during this 3-decade period. And we count there were a total of 7 major incursions. So all these forces, once they entered the Korean peninsula, they would attack various regions in the middle and southern parts of the Korean peninsula, but all the northern parts were hit every single time. So it made the lives of the Koryeo people in that particular region very miserable. And actually in the early mid-1230s, I believe, there was a person named Hong Bogwan, and the Hong house under his control, they decided to surrender to the Mongol forces fairly early on during the 3-decade war. And after that, they were actually recruited by the Mongol authorities, and they were awarded with a vast region in the Liaodong region above the Korean peninsula. And later on, that family became the leading force of the Liaoyang branch secretariat, which was tasked with controlling the Liaodong region in general. And added to that, later on in I'm not sure the exact year, but King Wonjong, I just mentioned in the lecture, he was enthroned in 1260 and was replaced by his son King Chunyo in 1274 when he died. He, in the year 1269 and 1270, he was once dethroned by his own vassal. And that was a very huge political scandal, and the Yuan imperial government intervened to nullify that kind of change in throne. But at the time, a Koryeo local prefect named Chetan, he used this political incident to justify his surrender to the empire. And with his empire, the region above the Pyongyang city today was additionally usurped by the empire. So, and that region only came back to Koryeo in the early 1290s, I believe. And other regions that had been usurped by the empire much earlier was only able to be returned to Koryeo in 1356. Yeah, so the people in the northern part of the peninsula and the other parts of the peninsula experienced a very different life and reacted to it differently. However, I'm not sure whether or not that would have contributed to the overall different sentiments of North and South today. I'm not sure, but the reality was like that back then. Yeah.
Thank you. Next question by Sonu Park. Thank you for your insightful lecture. I feel it breaks from the traditional historiography of the Mongol rule post-invasions as all negative. Have you studied Koryå's role during the Mongol invasion of Japan?
Yeah. Of course, not as much as other historians who dedicate their studies to the Korea-Japan relationship or Japanese history in general. There were two campaigns targeting Japan in like 1274-5 and 1280-81, and both experiences were very miserable to the Goryeo people because at that point, Koryõ was only the war of the Mongols only ended like 1.5 decade ago. So, they were only trying to survive, but added to that, the government was serving like as a proxy for the Mongol imperial government and as demanding that Koryõ households deliver all kinds of materials, workers, and resources. So it was a hard time for the Goryeo public and, of course, for the Goryeo government as well. But there are certain different nuances, and in the first Japanese campaign in the mid-1270s, the Goryeo government was at a loss and had to follow the empire's orders to the letter. But later on, in the second campaign, the Goryeo government began to use its heads and try to demand some things from the empire as well. So it was like, we will obey, oblige, and do this campaign for you again, but you would have to give me some things that you would have to give me some more authority, and you should also positively answer to my request to exclude some figures from participating in this campaign because they had been very much detrimental to my own authority, the Goryeo king, and so that kind of things were different for the Goryeo government. It was involving in its response to the empire. But I'm sorry, I don't think this answer is the right answer to the original question. Would it be?
No, I think it should. Yeah, I think it's fine. I mean, it was just question about whether there was what was Koryå's role during the Mongol invasion of Japan.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, it was big, but in the first campaign, Koryõ had to do so many things. But in the second campaign, because the second campaign was after the Chinese Song dynasty failed, and the Chinese Jongun region was made available to the Mongol imperial forces. So many ships and soldiers were prepared in the east coast of the east coast of China. So Koryõ was able to share the burden with China at the time. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Next question by Gulsen Kilti. Thank you, Professor Lee, for your great lecture about Yuan-Koryõ relations. The presence of the Chijong Jokyok in Korea, isn't it a sign that Yuan law might have been important in the Koryõ society? Unfortunately, we don't have that many examples in written sources that can support this, but I was thinking about the levirate custom and how, according to George's Qingzhi Zhao's thesis in 2001, King Chunghae might have followed this custom when he raped Gyeonghwa Gongju.
Yeah. Jijongjogyok, of course, it is the only extant copy of that particular law code, which was like declared in 1340s, and it was found in Korea, and it was the current historians and also Mongol historians were very much thrilled by its existence here. It's actually here at the Changsagok archives at the Academy of Current Studies where I am working. Yeah, there is a record in Koryōsa stating that King Uwang, who was the son of King Gongmin, ordered all the local offices throughout the Korean Peninsula have a copy of 지정조교 at the office and consult in them in certain issues in which penal decisions would have to be made. That is a very evident. There's a very clear evidence that Yuan imperial law was embraced and used in Korea at some point. But this record is very peculiar because 1380s and late 1370s and early 1380s, this is a period in which the Mongol presence on the Korean Peninsula was growing very dim and weaker. It was actually fading away, and historians, myself included, always wondered why such order from the king would not have been issued much earlier, when the empire was very strong, like during the early 14th century. So the record, this King Uang record, it suggests two things: that the Koryɔ people were aware and did understand the existence and nature and contents of the Yuan law, but it refrained from using it actually in their everyday dealing with explicitly Koryɔ situations, because the territory, the customs were so much different between the Koryɔ conditions and the Mongol law. So using it to the letter could have caused some problems inside Koryɔ and may have disrupted the people's lives, and may have gone against the people's expectations to how law should be reinforced in particular situations. So, the Mongol law or imperial law was not exclusively used. It may have been consulted from time to time alongside the Koryɔ law during the early half of the 14th century. And later on, the Koryɔ government may have decided to make that kind of consultation a little bit more official and more prevalent. Because at the time, the late 14th century was a time during which the Koryɔ government was trying to re-enhance its own law code. So the Koryɔ government was searching for old ancient law codes from China, like the Tang records, the Song records, and were even trying to consult the newly born Ming law codes as well. So this record from the Uang period, that seems like Koryɔ was trying to embrace the Yuan law codes as well, as part of an effort to relaunch its own law codes, consulting many collections of law codes from China. So I think that it is.
Thank you. That's very helpful, because I also had a follow-up question on that one. So I was going to ask, why we know that Tang law and Ming law had a huge influence in Korea, especially during Tang law in Koryɔ, and also Ming law, especially during Joseon period, because especially penal law was fully adopted and used until the end of the Joseon dynasty. So then it raises question, then what is the position of Yuan law, or how Koryɔ officials perceived, understood Yuan law. So I think what you're now just saying, it seems like they were trying to come up with a comprehensive code, adopting from Tang, Yuan, and Ming code during the late Koryɔ dynasty. So I guess was there any comprehensive? Was there an attempt to kind of publish comprehensive legal codes in Koryɔ?
Yeah, a famous official named Jongun, he was also trying to. I should go through the records again, of course, but I think that this is after the aforementioned order from King Uang. I think he had a draft like based upon all kinds of previous laws, including 지정조교, and of course the Ming law, contemporary Ming law as well. I'm not sure he actually presented the king with a version or not. I'm not sure, but the efforts would have been definitely on the way. But as we all know, Koryō was dismantled in 1392. So if the dynasty was allowed to exist a little bit longer, then another version of Koryō-Yul perhaps may have come out, but we cannot be sure.
Well, in history we know that 경국대전 was published about a century later. So okay, all right, thank you.
지정조교 is being mentioned many times during the 15th century as well by Joseon lawmakers.
Okay, thank you. Next by Thea Hong. Thank you so much for your insightful presentation about the exchange of ceramics you mentioned. I wondered what the traditional Koryō celadon are in terms of the deformities and patterns. I was also wondering what methodology was applied in the study of Koryō celadon used in Yuan.
I'm not an expert in Koryō ceramics, but there are many like vases and utensils, but there are some unique. In Korean pronunciation, we call them like 고족배, very, I'm not sure how to describe. But if we examine all the relics from this period, definitely new kinds of utensils or shapes emerge in this period. And without exception, all these new shapes and figures we can spot them in Yuan ceramics and porcelain as well. So we can see that Koryō producers and consumers were like very much impressed and inspired by such new shapes and figures. So many of them are being found in Koryō, so that indicates that they were not only imported from China, they were also made in Koryō as well. But at the same time, if we examine all the Koryō artifacts that have been and still now being excavated in China at Yuan period historical vestiges, Koryō ceramics are frequently found, and most of these ones do not feature Yuan style new shapes and designs. They, in many cases, feature traditional Koryō shapes and figures and patterns. So this led me to hypothesize that maybe if we put ourselves into the shoes of the people back then, and let's presume that I was like a ceramic producer and a merchant who was engaged in export businesses. If I were to make some ceramics that were meant to be exported to China, I would have to engage in the prospect of how much of it and in what kind of product could make money in the market of China at the time. And I think that I would not make products that would bear striking resemblances or similarities with items being produced in China right now, because Koryō products with same shapes and figures to Chinese products would not stand a chance to be like sold or being appreciated. Only like traditional indigenous styles and shapes could be appreciated more whenever they enter the Chinese market. So that was what led me to make such hypothesis. Yeah, people are studying. There are so many other experts, so I would have to refer you to them. Sorry.
All right, thank you. Next, we have comments by Professor Edward Schultz. The Koryō records give us a very negative view of the early kings, focusing on sexual transgressions, disdain between father and son, You have read beyond these sources, which is great, and perhaps the historical records have helped create this earlier negative attitude. Do you have any comments to make about sources?
No. Yeah. The feud between King Chungnyeol and Chungseon, and Chungseon and Chungsuk, and Chungsuk and Chunghae for that matter, is very famous. And of course, historical records have been very detailed in describing such conflicts. And because of the detailed nature of those records, I tend to believe that some of them were true. But I think that there would have been some other factors underlying these conflicts, because records only say that Chungnyeol was very much afraid of King Chungseon harming his own father himself, and records only tell that King Chungseon was very much indifferent to King Chungsuk's welfare, and he was indifferent to his own son's welfare to the extent of trying to elevate his own nephew, the cousin of his own son Chungsuk, to a new level inside Yuan, which later caused the tension between King Chungsuk and this figure, nephew of King Chungseon. The fact, I think, is this: King Chungnyeol was a Koryõ figure who was very much a figure accustomed to the old ways of Koryõ. Then he was forced to marry a Mongol princess, and that was a huge change and stress on him. Added to that, he had to navigate through all the politics that was imposed upon him for the very first time. No other Koryõ kings experienced that kind of burden. So he was trying to use his status as the husband of a Mongol princess to the best of his abilities for his own well-being and for the well-being of the country. Then King Chungseon came. Chungseon was a hybrid, and I think King Chungnyeol may have considered his own son very much alien to him. And I think that King Chungnyeol would not have known how to deal with his own son, because he was not only a hybrid, he was the maternal grandson of Emperor Kublai, the ultimate source of authority for all Chinese and Koryõ people at the time. So there was an inherent seed of conflict between those two figures. And of course, Chungseon, Chungsuk, Chunghae, they were all father and sons, but were going through different situations and were from different backgrounds. King Chungseon also married a Mongol princess, but the relationship was very rocky, and they soon kind of divorced. King Chungsuk married 3 Mongol princesses, Mongol females, but they were all from lower households, and they did not hold any weight that would help King Chungsuk navigate his own way through Mongol politics. And King Chungnyeol was another matter. So yeah, they were not getting along, that's for sure. But reasons were a little bit different from things that were mentioned in official records. I'll just say that.
Thank you. Since we began 10 minutes late, I think we can use 10 more minutes here, although it's 8:30 now. I would like to apologize to our audience for the technical issues that we had at the beginning. It looks like the link that we sent out wasn't working, and people weren't able to join webinar. But I'm glad that those of you who were able to join us today, were able to listen to Professor Lee's lecture. So we'll take maybe 2 or 3 more questions. All right, so next question by King Kwong Wong. Thank you for your fascinating and great discussion of Koryõ in the 13th to 14th centuries and future directions of studies. I would like to learn more about material cultural exchanges. You mentioned that Yuan design might inspire Koryō-Rami-based Nazi-style textiles. Do you have any surviving example of this kind of textiles or any visual representation of this kind in other media that we can see today?
Yeah, actually, that's a little bit tricky because the concept of nasij, it suggests a cloth or fabric that has been decorated with gold threads or silver threads, for that matter, but the definition can be fluid because some nasij relics show the entire surface of a cloth being covered with gold threads, metallic threads, or others only show some limited appliances of gold threads to express the patterns on the surface of the cloth. So there are many types of nasij fabrics. That's my understanding. And in this period, in the 13th century and especially the 14th century, especially the fabrics that have survived time and are estimated to have been from this particular time period, and there are indeed some fabrics that have been decorated with metallic threads, gold threads, of course. What was very much peculiar to me was that all the fabrics, nasij type fabrics that we can find from Chinese vestiges right now, they are without exception applied on the surface of silk. But in Korean cases, there are some extant materials that exhibit all these nasij type gold thread applications applied to the surface of fabrics other than silk, for example, rami. I suppose that's because rami was such a huge material for the Goryeo people for the since the ancient days. The Korean Peninsula was very much famous throughout the entire Northeast Asia to produce high-quality rami-based apparels and attires. So it would have only been natural for the Goryeo people, I suppose, to try applying such high-tech design skills to a base material that was so different from the base material being used in China. And that kind of decision would have led to the production of some materials that would have appeared very exotic and unique in the eyes of the Chinese consumers as well. So with all these, of course, limited evidences left on the Korean Peninsula, I also tended to guess that that would have been a huge thing back then. So that was where I was going with it. Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you. Next question by Jasmine Angel Guzman. Thank you for your insightful lecture. Even when fusion continued, you said differences prevailed. Although Koryō sovereignty was challenged, was the source of legitimacy for hybrid kings also challenged as well, or not to the same extent?
Yeah. The Goryeo public and the officials at the time, especially those who were serving the court of King Chungnyeong, they may have considered King Chungsun as an anomaly and may have had some reservations whether or not to support him as a legitimate Goryeo king in the beginning. But at the same time, he was the grandson of such a famous emperor. So it was even dangerous for them to ignore the inherent authority of King Chungsun. So in that regard, I cannot say that King Chungsun's authority was ever challenged by the Goryeo people, Goryeo officials, because at the time, when King Chungsun was first enthroned in 1298, he was present in Koryeo for 8 straight months and only left Koryeo and returned to China in August that year because he was dethroned by the imperial government. Then later on, a decade later, in 1308, when he resumed the Goryeo throne, after the enthronement ceremony, he went right back to China and never returned to Koryeo for 5 straight years during his reign. And he only returned to Koryeo to abdicate the Goryeo throne and enthrone his own son, King Chungsuk. And after the enthronement ceremony, he went right back to China again. And so that particular fact led Korean historians to evaluate that King Chungseong was very much indifferent to governing Korea properly, but I tend to disagree because so many things have been changed during his reign. And if we examine the text carefully, we can see that King Chungseong was pulling the strings, actually. And even during the time that he was not present physically in Korea, there was not a single discussion inside the Korea government to like question his authority or his sincerity or his legitimacy. Only officials trying to bring him home sooner than later. But King Chungseong had other plans because in his mind, he was doing more good things to Korea by staying in one, because he was able to like contact people who can make decisions, important ones, and affect the fate of Korea. So he was like envisioning a state, like he would stay in China as a former king and make his own son the Korea king, and have his own nephew assume another important post. So he would like to play a master to some things. But yeah, so considering all that, I don't think that the Korea kings' authority were ever challenged because of the fact that they were hybrids. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I think this will be, well, I'll take last two questions. I'll ask at the same time. So first by Chunan Park, war certainly takes a large amount of people's death. What was Mongols' main target when they invaded Korea? What made Mongols desperately spend time and energy to conquer Korea? Or perhaps maybe another way to ask is, what was their aim of, in their
Yeah.
So what was the significance for Mongols in invading Korea? Maybe that's you could also.
That is kind of a mystery to me as well. Yeah. So the Korean Peninsula was not particularly hostile to the Mongols in the very beginning. So we cannot say that Goryeo was being punished for some previous provocation on Goryeo's part, but we cannot also say that the reason Mongols invaded Korea is because that was in their nature. The Mongols were inherently aggressive, so they had to conquer everything in their sight. That may be true, but maybe not. So I also wonder why Mongols would have had to invade Korea and harass it for 30 years until it finally surrendered. I think that has something to do with the strategic importance of the Liaodong region. And because the Liaodong region at the time, the three younger brothers of Genghis Khan were in power, and they have formed a pretty much powerful polity at the east side of the empire, of which the center was at Beijing. So later on, of course, the invasion of Korea was also primarily handled by the Mongol forces, which were originally in the Liaodong region. So for them, the Mongol polities in the Liaodong region, the Korean Peninsula, or the invasion of it, or the securing of it, may have been helpful to enlarging their own sphere of power. And later on, the reason that Beijing also became interested in the strategic importance of Korea was because the government at Beijing was trying to find some ways to control the Liaodong region as well. And in order to do so, it became important for the central government at Beijing to secure a new relationship between itself and the Korean Peninsula to put the Liaodong region in check. And actually, some historians in Korea also theorized that the reason Kublai, who was first hesitant to give his own daughter to the Goryeo king, finally was able to agree to the idea and authorize the marriage to proceed, was to reinforce Beijing's relationship with the Korean Peninsula to prevent the Liaodong region from gaining too much influences upon the peninsula. and use it in their conflicts with the central government at Beijing. Yeah.
Right, thank you. One last question about sources. So we have a question from Zhongtian Han, who is our PhD student in history department. Thank you, Professor Lee, for your talk. Could you talk more about the sources we have on this period, apart from Korean and Chinese sources? Are there sources in other languages that we can use? Also, how should we use the sources in different languages, perspectives?
Yeah. Of course, the Korean alphabet was not invented at this time period, so all these materials that I introduced earlier are in Chinese letters. Some of them are translated into Koreans right now. Most of them I introduced in this lecture are in Korean as of this point. All the Koryō and Koryō are official records, so they present a chronological documentation of how things went on. So they are very much useful for us to determine the flow of historical events. And 신중 동북 여지승남 is a geographical encyclopedia and contains detailed records of every individual local units that exists in the Goryeo period. So if Koryō and Koryō are records constructed from a perspective as the central government as the ultimate protagonist, 신중 동북 여지승남 is a collection of records created by the local population, the local leaders, of course. Sun is another matter because it's a compilation of classic Korean writings, like produced in the ancient Silla period, the Goryeo period, and early Joseon period. So among them, many governmental records, personal records, and many artistic creations. They are all among them. So that's also a very important historical record that we can rely on. But pure gems are from the individual anthologies like 동국 이상국집, 동안거사집, 익제집, 가정집, 졸고천백. These are personal anthologies that contain records left by people who actually lived in the 13th and 14th centuries. So they are invaluable. And of course, the epitaphs are also great. Yeah, actually, but how shall we consult materials in other languages? Yeah. Actually, it's my understanding that the Cambridge history of the Mongol Empire is due to be published, I'm not sure, next year, I suppose. There is I think this particular book is in two parts. One would be the history of the Mongols, of course, and the second part would be composed of individual chapters that are dedicated to the introduction of many records depicting situations of the period, but in many different languages. Yeah, so there is also a chapter of records written by, not in Korean, but in Chinese, but the Goryeo people. I had the privilege of writing that chapter, so yeah. Other than that chapter, records in different languages are all introduced in that book, I suppose. So that book, if it comes out, would be extremely helpful for every one of us. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. I know we still have a few more questions left. I'm sorry I won't be able to get to all of those questions. It's already 8:45, and I think we need to end our session now. So, I hope our audience will join me in thanking Professor Lee for his very insightful lecture. We really learned a lot today. And also, I would like to thank our audience for joining us until the end. And I apologize once again for the technical issue that we had at the beginning. Thank you so much, everyone, and hope to see you again. So just one announcement. Actually, we will be having one of our last events on December 8th, and that will be by Professor Han Myung-gi from Korea, and he will be talking about regional affairs in Joseon dynasty. So especially focusing on the Min-Qing transition period. So hopefully you'll be able to join us again. And thank you so much once again, and have a great evening.
Thank you very much.